Enough. Susan, my mother shouted, her voice trembling with frustration as she leaned forward, her glare cutting through the tension like a blade. The ornaments on the Christmas tree sparkled faintly under the dim glow of the living room lights, but the festive warmth felt painfully hollow. I sat frozen, my hands gripping my lap as I struggled to quell the anger rising inside me. You always have to make everything about you, my dad added sharply. His words stung more than I'd anticipated. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantle. My name is Susan Blanchard. I was 32 years old then, and it was Christmas Eve in the late 1970s, a time when families like ours in rural Illinois depended on one another. Our family farm, passed down for generations, was struggling to stay afloat. Years earlier, I had moved to Chicago to become a lawyer, a choice my parents still viewed as a betrayal of our roots. Meanwhile, my older brother Jake had stayed behind, running the farm and basking in the glow of our parents' constant praise. I didn't resent him for staying, it was how they treated me that stung. No matter what I did, I was always the outsider. Since the summer, I had quietly sent money to the farm's shared account, hoping to ease the mounting bills. Jake had asked me to keep it between us, insisting it would hurt our parents' pride if they knew. At the time, it made sense. I trusted Jake to handle it. But now, sitting at the table, I listened as my parents heaped praise on him for sacrificing so much to save the farm. The deep sense of betrayal I felt was impossible to ignore. Jake's the reason we've been able to keep things going, my mom said, her voice thick with pride. I don't know what we'd do without him. I looked across the room at Jake, expecting some sign of acknowledgement or guilt. Instead, he leaned back in his chair with a smirk, clearly relishing the moment. That was my breaking point. Actually, I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the chatter, I'm the one who's been sending money every month since July. My dad scoffed, shaking his head as though I just said something absurd. Don't start making things up, Susan. Jake's been here day in and day out, working his tail off for this family. Why would you even say something like that? The dismissive tone stung more than the words. My mom crossed her arms, her expression cold. Honestly, Susan, it's Christmas. Can we not ruin the evening with your need for attention? Anger surged through me, humiliation burning in its wake. I'm not making it up, I said firmly. I've been depositing money at the Chicago branch of the bank, directly into the farm account. Every single deposit came from me. But they weren't listening. My dad waved me off with an exasperated sigh, and my mom turned to Jake, who shrugged, feigning innocence. The frustration was unbearable. Are you really going to sit there and lie, Jake? I demanded, my voice sharp. You know I've been making those deposits. Jake didn't flinch. He leaned back further, his smirk widening. I have no idea what you're talking about, Susan, he said with a tone dripping in false innocence. My blood boiled. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. But our parents didn't seem to care. My dad sighed heavily, as if I were the one ruining the evening, while my mom cast Jake a sympathetic glance, as though he were the victim. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor, locking eyes with Jake. I said, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Those deposits weren't small. You've been letting our parents believe you're some kind of hero when all you've done is lie. If you don't admit it now, I'll leave first thing tomorrow and get the proof myself. Jake shrugged, leaning back with infuriating nonchalance. You're wasting your time, Susan, he said with a chuckle. Whatever story you've cooked up, go ahead and prove it. His smirk only fueled my determination. I wasn't going to let him get away with this, not this time. The next morning, I packed my bags, unable to endure another moment in that house. When I told my parents I was leaving, my mom sighed, her voice heavy with disapproval. It's Christmas, Susan. she said, as if I were the one ruining everything. My dad didn't even look up from his coffee. Can't go a single holiday without causing a scene, he muttered. Jake, of course, barely hid his grin, lounging smugly in his chair as though he'd already won. I didn't respond. I wasn't staying, not with everyone acting like I was the problem. The drive back to Chicago felt endless. Snow-covered fields and frozen lakes blurred past, my grip on the steering wheel tightening with every mile. Jake didn't believe I'd actually do it. He probably thought I'd stew in silence, too intimidated by our parents' blind faith in him to act. But this time was different. I was done being dismissed, done letting him walk all over me. When the banks reopened, I went straight to the Chicago branch. The bitter cold stung my skin as I stepped inside, the warmth of the bank a welcome relief. Good morning, the teller greeted me with a polite smile. How can I help you today? I explained my request, my tone firm but measured. I need copies of every deposit I've made to the Blanchard farm account since July. The teller nodded and disappeared into the back. Minutes later, he returned with a stack of receipts, proof. As I left the bank, clutching the papers tightly, I felt a wave of determination. Jake had underestimated me, but soon enough, everyone would know the truth. Here? I asked, my voice sharp but steady. The months of silence and their treatment still stung, but I was no longer the same person who had walked out of that farmhouse. My dad rubbed the back of his neck, his usual confidence replaced with something I hadn't seen in him before, uncertainty. My mom stared at the floor, her hands fidgeting with the clasp on her purse. Susan, my dad started, his voice soft. We owe you an apology. I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. An apology? From them? My arms crossed instinctively as I leaned against the wall, keeping my distance. Go on, I said, my tone guarded. We were wrong, my mom said, her voice trembling. She finally looked up at me, her eyes glassy. About everything, about Jake, about you. You were telling the truth all along. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, I couldn't respond. All the times I'd pleaded for them to believe me, the hours I'd spent doubting myself, and the nights I'd cried over their betrayal, all of it came rushing back. What changed? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Why now? My dad sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Jake. He let the farm go under, he admitted, his voice laced with regret. We didn't realize how much he'd been contributing until it was too late. He lied about everything. My mom nodded, her shoulders slumping. We found out he'd been siphoning money for himself, using it for God knows what. The farm's in foreclosure now. And her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. We should have believed you, my dad finished, his voice thick with guilt. You tried to warn us, and we shut you out. A part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to relish in their regret, but another part of me, the part that had yearned for their acknowledgement and love, felt a pang of sadness. Do you know how much it hurt? I asked, my voice softer now. I gave everything I could to help, and you treated me like a liar, like I didn't matter. My mom nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. We were blind, Susan, and we're so sorry. We came here because we need your help. The farm. No, I interrupted firmly. Their heads snapped up, surprised by the conviction in my voice. I'm not bailing you out. Not again. My dad opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. I've spent enough of my life trying to prove myself to you. I'm done. If Jake wants to fix this mess, let him. But I won't keep sacrificing myself for people who only see my worth when they're desperate. Silence filled the room, heavy and uncomfortable. My mom wiped her eyes, and my dad looked away, his jaw tight. We understand, my mom finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. We just wanted you to know how sorry we are. I nodded, my own emotions threatening to spill over. Thank you for saying that, but I've moved on. You should too. They stood slowly, the weight of their mistakes evident in their movements. At the door, my dad hesitated. If you ever want to talk, we're here. I nodded again, not trusting myself to speak. When the door closed behind them, I sank onto the couch, the tension finally releasing from my body. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just tired. But I also felt something else, free. For the first time in a long time, I knew I'd made the right choice. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I wasn't the outsider anymore, I was my own person, and that was enough. I leaned against the armrest of a chair, arms crossed tightly. Go on, I said sharply, cutting through the thick silence. Whatever they had to say, I wanted it out in the open. My dad stared at the floor, his voice low and hesitant. Susan, we owe you an apology, a big one. My mom nodded, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. We were wrong, she said softly. We didn't believe you when you tried to tell us the truth, and we need to make it right. I crossed my arms, leaning back in the chair. Keep talking, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Dad let out a heavy sigh. After you left, things started falling apart on the farm. Bills piled up, equipment broke down, and the crops didn't bring in enough to keep us going. At first, we thought Jake had it handled. He kept saying he'd figure it out. He trailed off, glancing at my mom, who picked up where he left off, her voice trembling. He confessed. Susan, he admitted it. You were the one making the deposits all those months. You were the reason we stayed afloat. Tears filled her eyes as she continued. We couldn't believe it, not just that he lied, but that we didn't listen to you when you tried to tell us. We're sorry, Susan, truly sorry, for not believing you, for how we treated you, for everything. You didn't deserve any of it. I studied their faces and, for the first time, saw genuine shame. My dad looked up, his expression heavy with regret. We're asking for your forgiveness, Susan, he said quietly. I know we don't deserve it, but we had to come here and tell you the truth. You saved the farm, and we owe you more than an apology. I let their words hang in the air, part of me tempted to let the silence stretch forever, forcing them to sit with their guilt. Instead, I asked, "Where's Jake?" My voice was calm, but anger simmered beneath the surface. My mom exchanged a nervous glance with my dad before answering. He's still at the farm. He wanted to come, but we thought it was better to speak to you alone first. Dad nodded, shifting uncomfortably. He's been keeping to himself since he admitted everything. I think he knows there's no excuse for what he did. Ashamed? I repeated bitterly, letting out a sharp laugh. That's rich. After months of letting you believe I was a liar, after taking credit for everything I did to keep the farm running? Dad looked down, his face pale. You're right, he admitted softly. We let it go on far too long. That's on us as much as it is on him. But he wanted us to tell you he's sorry. He knows he doesn't deserve forgiveness. Oh, he wanted you to tell me? I snapped, leaning forward. Are you serious? You're still protecting him. Even now, he should be here apologizing to my face. You should have forced him to come. My voice echoed through the room, and I saw the shock on their faces. I didn't care. I was done tiptoeing around their favoritism. My mom opened her mouth, but I cut her off. Do you even hear yourselves? He lies, manipulates, and twists everything I did into some heroic story for himself. And now, when it's time to take responsibility, you're still shielding him? What? He's too embarrassed to face me, so you're here cleaning up his mess? Do you realize how insane that sounds? Dad shifted uncomfortably, gripping his knees. We thought this would be easier for everyone, he muttered. Easier for who? I shot back. For Jake? For you? Because it sure as hell isn't easier for me. Neither of them responded. Mom stared at her hands, twisting the strap of her purse, while Dad clenched his jaw. The silence stretched until Dad finally stood, his voice quiet. You're right. We should have brought him. We should have made him face you. I don't know why we didn't. Maybe because we've been making excuses for him for so long. It's just what we do. Mom followed, clutching her purse to her chest. She looked at me with watery eyes, her voice barely a whisper. We're sorry, Susan. You deserved better from all of us. Without waiting for my response, they walked to the door. Dad paused, glancing back at me, regret etched into his face, before closing the door softly behind them. For a long time, I sat there, the weight of their shame lingering like a ghost. For the first time, it felt like they finally saw the truth. A week later, there was another knock at my door. When I opened it, my stomach turned. Jake stood there, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, looking as miserable as I'd ever seen him. Susan, he said hesitantly, can I come in? I considered slamming the door in his face but stepped aside, letting him in without a word. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room, shifting his weight. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I came to apologize. For everything. For lying. For taking credit for the money you sent. For letting Mom and Dad treat you the way they did. His voice cracked. But I said nothing. Waiting. I don't have an excuse. He continued. I was jealous. I've always been jealous. You've done so much with your life. And I stayed behind. I thought if I kept their approval, I'd feel important. But it was wrong. All of it. Jake's voice broke completely, and he buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with heavy sobs. They weren't the kind you fake. They were raw, filled with shame. For a moment, I just stood there, unsure of what to say or do. After that day, things shifted. My parents didn't call right away, but when they did, their tone was different. No defensiveness, no excuses. My dad mentioned they were handling the farm finances themselves now. Mom let it slip that Jake was working to make things right. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. As for Jake, he stayed out of my way after that apology. He didn't try to fix things too quickly, which was fine by me. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. But knowing my family finally saw the truth and the hurt they'd caused was enough to give me a little peace.